Inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me to this project, also to the International Advisory Board. I think this is a great honor. I would like to say that what I'm presenting today is, in a way, work in progress, even though it's based on sources that I've worked with earlier. But historiography, as far as I can see, is developing so quickly that based on these old sources, which is an advantage for more experienced historians, questions change so quickly due to other developments in historiography that I thought it makes sense to reconsider some of this material for the purpose today. And as Mary Wisner-Hanks, I'm not prepared with a PowerPoint. And since I'm interested in what you think about what I'm telling you, it might be even easier not to be distracted by picture after picture. At one point of time, I will share a picture. Okay, so the title of my presentation, which was in a way also a surprise to me, is Global History of Emotion. What I would like to do is to talk about a few examples and then try to make sense of them and just kind of lead over into our discussion. So the vantage point of my presentation is this insight that separation was and is a ubiquitous experience. But does this make it any easier to investigate separation as a topic in history? Obviously, no, because if the question of how experiences of separation were communicated in history were easy to answer, then this important research project or research group that you have in Lund would not have received any funding, I assume. So this is already a preliminary assumption. In order to be communicated at all, separations must have been perceived as experiences worthy of communication in the first place. Events and experiences worthy of communication then are usually those that are perceived as standing out of normality, from normality. Everyday things are usually less frequently reported than those we are used to or expecting. But that is precisely what separations were not extraordinary, at least not in early modern history. In the pre-modern era, separations, and I'm talking here about those that lie beyond anthropological constants, such as the cutting of the umbilical cord, were not exceptional, but were the norm. If we think of the shorter lifespans and separations caused by death, by illness, by war. In addition, there were separations caused by absence, be it because people went on journeys, because people engaged in slavery and servitude, because parents sent the children out to work. Historians of previous generations have therefore come to the conclusion that people in the pre-modern era were indifferent to strong emotional experiences, did not even recognize or perceive them as such because they occurred too frequently, were too ubiquitous. However, today I would like to present a slightly different argument. My initial thesis is that the anticipation of impending separations shaped human societies socially in such a way that they were structurally prepared for these separations. For example, through godparenthoods, through guardianships, through the installing or installment of teachers and educators, through extended household concepts and family practices, and also, I think, through different kinship concepts, which links our topic today also to anthropology. Kinship concepts such as blood kinship, in-law kinship, and also spiritual kinship, of which godparenthood already is an example. Those were closely intertwined and therefore suitable and almost intended to cushion separations. So one could conclude that if separations in the early modern period were a kind of serial experience, and if they were therefore not actually discussed because they were part of everyday life and not something that stood out, How can it be explained then that separations were not only part of everyday life on an empirical level, on an historical level, but were also discussed or narrated as such incisive experiences? So, the task I set myself in this lecture today is to present some of these divisions and separations and the ways in which they were communicated, and to reflect on why they were deemed worthy of mentioning. The underlying sources are usually texts that depict this communication, if you wish, and therefore communicate the experiences in a more mediated way and for different reasons. So it's therefore not a question today of claiming authenticity, but of first and foremost asking about the contexts and references in the sources. So eventually I will attempt a very brief systematization from the perspective of the history of emotions. And here I turn to my first example. So in 1728, Vitus Bering left his wife and two children to set off on his first Kamchatka expedition that you have definitely heard of. His wife, Anna Christina, and their two sons, Jonas and Thomas, aged 9 and 11, stayed behind in Viborg, Denmark. Upon his return in 17th, oh, this is a mistake, I'm sorry, his wife and their two sons, Jonas and Thomas, who were very small at the time, stayed behind in Viborg, Denmark. Upon his return in 1730, the couple had two children within 15 months, and Vitus planned his second Kamchatka expedition. This time, he was accompanied by his wife and their two youngest children, Anushka, 1 year old, and Vitus, almost 2 years old. The journey took them from March 1732 via Tobolsk and Irkutsk to Yakutsk, and another 6 months later to Okhotsk in the far northeast of Siberia. There they arrived in November 1733. The average temperature during the 7 winter months was 40 degrees Celsius minus. The journey was about 7,000 kilometers in one direction and was clearly characterized by inhospitable travel conditions. The aim of the journey was to send the second expedition by water in order to find the Northwest Passage, today's Bering Strait, which was so important in global trade because it promised shorter routes. Anna Christina and the two small children had originally planned to start the return journey after 2 years, but the 2 years then turned into 10 years. 10 years in which they did not see their two oldest sons, 10 years in which they received letters once a year and were able to send letters back once a year. 10 years in which they received increasingly disturbing news of their sons reaching adulthood and the network in which they had left them. 10 years in which Anna Christina maintained a middle-class domestic life in one of the coldest places in the world, with piano lessons and French lessons, alive as a wife, as a housewife, and as a mother. As far as I could verify, she was the only wife accompanying one of the expedition members. So after 8 years, Anna Christina decided to make the return journey, and it took her another 2 years to cover the 7,500 kilometers across the whole of Russia. She took her two children, Anushka and Vitus, with her. Vitus, the father, set off with his group to the North Sea, but by the time Anna Christina and her children had reached Moscow, Vitus had already died, and she would not receive news of his death for another 6 years. So the sources for this example contain a treasure trove, because letters that the mother addressed to her children, but also to other relatives and friends, in which she reflected not only on her two older sons, but also on her decision to accompany her husband and leave her sons behind, which seems strange to modern readers. The two brothers had remained in Viborg in the care of a schoolmaster who took them into his home and with whom the Berings had been friends for some time. Apparently, there was a plan to marry one of them off to a daughter of the house. This plan was never put into practice, possibly because Jonas, the oldest son, took a path that nobody approved of. Contrary to his parents' wishes and the ideas of his teacher and father-like guardian, Jonas had decided to join the military. This would not have been a problem in itself, but his skills were just good enough to join the lowest rank of musketeers. His mother explains this with his lack of intellectual ability and discipline. She feared he would stay in cheap inns and take up drinking. She urged him to keep his hands off women and expressed her fear that he could endanger his life as a young man, for example, by having an arm or a leg blown off, or even worse, losing his eyesight. The younger brother developed in a more stable and consistent way, finishing school with halfway acceptable grades. However, he also decided to join the military, only this time his mother hoped to arrive in St. Petersburg, where he was now living, before he did. So during the 10 years, the two brothers were looked after not only by the schoolmaster, but also by other friends of the Berings and other family members who reported to their parents. The reply letters from Okhotsk from the last year of 1742 have fortunately survived. Anna Bering is clearly the one who maintains the correspondence. Vitus hardly interferes, but merely admonishes his sons to follow their mother's instruction and advice. These instructions are quite detailed and relate to educational tasks such as learning Russian, reading, geography, personal hygiene, and general manners sharpen your conduct. One almost gets the impression that the heated advice is a last attempt to regain control over the sons' careers, as they obviously did not meet their parents' expectations. And the question arises as to what could have prompted the parents, firstly, to leave two children aged 9 and 11 behind in Viborg, and secondly, to travel so far eastwards with two much younger children in conditions that, from today's perspective, were neither inviting nor safe. And thirdly, the question arises as to why Anna Bering did not return after 2 years, and finally, how she assessed and justified these decisions. So let's start with the simpler things. It was not unusual, as you know, in the early modern period for the brothers to stay with a schoolmaster and a married couple who were friends, even for a longer period of time. On the contrary, Anna Christina wrote to her friend that there was nothing for them to learn in Siberia, as the people were simple minded, hardly Christian, and there were no teachers around. Though she was still able to teach her younger children herself, but later on, younger members of the expedition students took over some of these tasks. Placing her older sons with the teacher seemed to be the more sensible consideration and measure at the time to ensure a good upbringing and education. The reason for taking the younger children with them was their young age. Presumably, both were still being breastfed, and separation from the younger siblings was out of the question, an unusual decision, as the two could have been cared for by a wet nurse. Instead, the parents separated from the older brothers, and they also separated the siblings from each other. So, a letter from the little Vitus to his older brother testifies to the distance between the two, as the younger one naturally has no memory of the older one, but his mother insisted that he wrote French letters to his unknown brother. The only ones who did not separate, the ones who stayed together, were the parents, Anna and Vitus. After almost 3 years of separation during the first Kamchatka expedition, both had obviously come to the conclusion that they would not be expected to undergo, or they would not be willing to undergo another such a separation. The fact that they had two children within a very short space of time also indicates a dynamic relationship and emotional bond. Perhaps the fact that they had lost two other children at a very early age also played a role here. To put it bluntly, it could be said that they prioritized their relationship as a couple over their relationship with their two older sons, who also were still relatively young. So Anna Bering was obviously a courageous woman. Not only did she take on the responsibility of traveling to Siberia with two small children for at least 4 years and raising them there in a healthy and bourgeois manner, sane and bourgeois manner, this decision, the couple's decision, distinguished her from the better part of her fellow wives and mothers. But after 8 years, she finally set off on the very long return journey with only 4 other companions, male soldiers. Her last letters to her sons and her friend indicate that her return was also driven by concern for the two older sons. It is all the more astonishing that after her arrival in Moscow in March 1744, it took her another 6 months to travel to St. Petersburg, where at least Thomas, the younger of the two, was now living. So modern mothers would have expected her to be drawn there immediately, but that was not the case. So for me, Anna and Vitus Bering symbolize a couple who takes their relationship and emotional bond in a surprising way, seriously. It's not to be expected that Anna would have given as one reason for her decision to accompany Vitus that she had suffered from the first separation that lasted for years. Nor is it to be expected that she would have said that she was simply not prepared to spend another 10 or so years with her children while Vitus traveled the world. Nor is it to be expected that she would have explicated her affection, her love to her husband as a reason for separating from the older children. And yet, these things may have played a role. Even in view of the perceived failure of the educational project of the two older sons, for whom the parents had of course wished and planned a life as scholars, Anna is not prepared to back down from the correctness of her decision. So this brings me to my second example, which is briefer. And it's intended to raise the question of emotional attachment from a different perspective while remaining in almost the same time and social class. It concerns the German Christoph Imhoff and 4 of his about 10 children. So his first 2 children he had in 1766 and 1768 with his mistress Anna Chapuzet, whom he had not married because he was still a soldier at the time. Their second son, Julius, had already been born in London, and Imhoff had succeeded in gaining the favor of an English lady in waiting who was also German as a portrait painter. 6-month-old Julius was entrusted to this lady in waiting when Imhoff, his partner, and their 2-year-old son, Karl, set off for India in March 1769. There were already signs of I call it a ménage à trois, on the crossing as Anna and the future governor, General Lord Hastings, had become close, and consequently Anna Imhoff, who had hired himself out as a soldier, and Hastings and little Karl moved into one house together in Madras. A few years later, Anna became Madame Hastings. Imhoff's time as a soldier in India had come to an end, and he first ran away to Calcutta and organized the return of the now 6-year-old Karl from there. The reason for this was also, as he said, or as he wrote to his brother, the perceived lack of educational opportunities for little Karl. The mission school was obviously out of question. According to Imhoff, the only thing Karl had learned reasonably well was English. Instead, the parents decided to send their son to London and also into the care of the aforementioned lady in waiting. The return journey in 1772 cost a relatively large amount of money, as Imhoff complained, and Karl was placed in the care of 2 elderly ladies who were also on their return journey. He was to have his meals once a week at the captain's table. Upon Karl's return to London, Anna herself returned to Madras and her future husband, while Imhoff hoped to find a new position in Calcutta. In the really amazingly extensive sources that Imhoff left behind, diaries, letters, travel reports, there is a reference to the fact that Imhoff had bought a boy shortly before Karl came to Calcutta at an auction very cheaply as the prices were low. According to Imhoff, this boy was very happy to come to him as he had previously been mistreated. Soon afterwards, Imhoff mentioned another boy who was already a little more expensive, as he said, but still cheap in a way. Significantly, he took these two children, who were about 5 to 6 years old, back to Germany with him in 1773. Although he traveled via London, he missed the opportunity to meet up with his two sons there. It almost seemed as if he was keeping his passage a secret. One reason may have been the state of his relationship with Anne Chapuisat, for although they were never married, they had been pretending to be a couple, and news of her unusual relationship with Hastings was now doing the rounds. Back in Germany, Imhoff quickly managed to make friends with a close friend of the court master at the court in Weimar and married her. This connection to the Weimar court was to have consequences, especially for the two children Imhoff had brought back from India. To be clear, they belonged to him, he owned them, they were his slaves, even if he never referred to them as such. Imhoff had more children with a second wife, even though she lived at the Weimar court and Imhoff lived quite far away at his family estate, together with, you guessed it, the two enslaved boys from India. However, Imhoff's material situation became increasingly precarious. He sold off piece after piece of his land, but he hardly found any new work and therefore had hardly any income. The court in Weimar supported him, but as the estrangement between him and his wife grew, so did the support. Well, in the end, he resorted to what appeared to be a drastic measure. He offered, or he wanted to sell the two children. They were now around 12 years old, and as Imhoff noted, quick-witted and shrewd, he described one of them as intelligent, and one of them was, as he said, even baptized. But the court refused. Either the purchase of enslaved black children had fallen into disrepute, or Imhoff's asking price was too high. Finally, he turned to the prince's tutor at the Weimar court and asked him to buy the boys from him for a low price, because according to Imhoff, the prince's tutor had a love for them before. In other words, Imhoff activated an emotional relationship in order to get rid of the children. Ironically, he also justified his request to give them away with his affection, which would seem to advise him to only give the children into the best hands. To cut a long story short, he could not sell them, but the court in Weimar agreed to take them in and bring them up. What became of them, whether Imhoff had visited them again, whether he thought of them, whether he perhaps even missed them, is beyond our knowledge. The fact is, however, that he managed to place them in predictably good hands before he himself died, seriously ill and impoverished, in Munich just 3 months later. His grave is unknown. Although he saw his two other sons in London again, Julius was not allowed to know that the man he was to meet in the park was his father. He was introduced to him as an acquaintance of the family. The older one, Karl, kept in touch with Imhoff's second wife and his siblings at the Weimar court for several years. So we do not know what became of the two boys, Hackerborder and Skunjai. Unfortunately, we have no access to their feelings or to sources that could tell us maybe a little bit how they felt, but we can trace their lives in broad strokes and note that they lived in relative constancy and companionship with Imhoff for over 8 years, a companionship he never shared with any of his other children or wives. The way in which Imhoff wrote about them suggests that he was devoted to them, appreciated their presence, and provided for them according to the standards of the time. The attempted sale of the two children can thus also be seen as an act of care. To modern ears, obviously, this is very difficult to bear. So, in comparison, it's noticeable that the separations I have presented were generally seen as more positive measures, as an opportunity to enable children who had been left behind or sent back to be educated and to learn social skills. In each case, this was preceded by separations that were most probably experienced negatively, even if they were hardly written about or communicated to the outside world. But even for Imhoff, the contradictory element is obvious, this tension. He wanted to sell the children in order to enable them to continue a life on his terms and at the same time to create a material basis for his own continued existence. Only when death became inevitable did he give the children to the court that seemed most suitable to them without any proceeds or any money. Leaving Julius, who was only 6 months old, behind at the English court might be disturbing, but it should also now have become clear that this decision was probably motivated more by concern for his survival than by indifference or carelessness. And I wanted to show you a picture of, let's see, a picture of Imhoff and his um, two Indian children, because this is the only depiction and a very rare depiction that we have. So here you can see Imhoff in the front, and then these two children in the back. They wear these turbans on their head. He touches the one in front, hands over a glove or something similar. Imhoff and the one of the I think it's Hakka border in the back look at us directly. The other one looks in a, I don't know, nice way to Imhoff. And this is also the only depiction we have of Imhoff, but also it's a very rare happening or event that we have a painting of these children that were quite common on European courts at the time, but not so much in family portraits. So there's a whole direction of research that we could follow or establish if we follow these paintings and if we follow the children that we can find on these paintings. This one is still in private ownership, so there is no access in public to see it. So let me try to give you a few very preliminary conclusions that might then lead into a broader discussion. So when I first encountered this topic of separation in my own research, I was not researching separation, but it was something that happened over and over again that I was amazed by how by decisions that parents or people in general made that included separations that appeared to be painful to me from a modern perspective. However, what the historical material has taught me over the years was that separation in history could be something positive, something that ensures and allows for survival, social survival, educational survival, material survival, something that could help to expand the network of caretakers, of people who feel responsible or take over responsibility. The very basic experience of sudden death, of sudden loss, might have prepared humans, adults, also children in the early modern era to handle and to cope with these separations as something that would always be in the air and pending. So if we investigate separations or the history of separation and their impact, their emotional impact, and also uh, through the ways that how they were communicated, we need, I think, as much context as possible, and also include sources that do not necessarily communicate these experiences of separation. For the broader picture, I think this radical contextualization is one of the most important pathways to follow. In addition, what I came to think over these examples, but also over other examples, especially when I was trying to research separation as a matter of experience among enslaved population, it's to really reconstruct and retrace as many examples as possible in order to compare them. And this would be also meant to enable us to allow for detecting and uncovering all these routinized practices to cope with separations or to install separations, but also to find ways that would let these separations, enforced or not, become something bearable, something could be understood, something that could be shaped by the people involved, also themselves to a certain extent. Mm, and it's also against this background that I think this comparative perspective that really also has a stand in quantity would allow to research and understand relationships and the impact of separation among those that are still thought to be hard to research, especially from the perspective of the history of emotions. And I'm speaking here of enslaved men, women, and children, people, though, who have almost left to nothing of their own documents or sources. What I also would advocate for, if we investigate the history of separations from the angle of a history of emotions, is to include more radically than we did so far non-written sources, material culture, oral sources, legends, songs, fairy tales. As I just try to show you the painting, so visual sources, visual art sources. And only then, and this would be my wish, or maybe also something I could contribute to the research project, is to rethink the global history of emotions as a comparative history of emotions under the conditions of radical historization and also contextualization. Thank you.